The direction of major power relations has always determined the world order. Since Trump's second term, many Western think tanks have been discussing and even hyping up the so-called reverse Nixon, which mimics U.S. President Nixon's approach in the 1970s of allying with China against the Soviet Union. They propose that the U.S. today could ally with Russia against China. The main arguments of this faction currently include the U.S. lifting or partially lifting sanctions on Russia, a comprehensive U.S.-Russia reconciliation, the U.S. pushing for a ceasefire in Ukraine, the U.S. potentially recognizing Russia's de facto control over parts of Ukrainian territory, and the U.S. proposing Russia's reinstatement as a G7 member, all in exchange for Russia distancing itself from China. Clearly, many of Trump's actions since his return to the White House have reflected these propositions, and major global media outlets have been eagerly discussing this topic, although most people seem not to be optimistic about this prospect. On March 19th this year, after a phone conversation between the Russian and U.S. leaders, a TASS correspondent in China interviewed me. He asked a question. Western public opinion believes that closer U.S.-Russia ties are aimed at containing China. What's your view on this? I said I wasn't worried at all. China and Russia have established a highly mature strategic mutual trust, and we have sufficient confidence in our Russian friends, just as Russia fully trusts China. Indeed, today's China-Russia relationship is a very mature, major power relationship. President Xi Jinping has visited Russia 11 times, and the two heads of state have met more than 40 times on various occasions. Such frequent and close communication between the two leaders itself demonstrates the high degree of mutual trust between China and Russia. The vast majority of Chinese and Russians are happy about this. Several American journalists have also asked me similar questions, and my answer is, the leaders of China and Russia are statesmen, not politicians, and certainly not businessmen. Statesmen are characterized by long-term political vision and an understanding of the overall interests of their respective nations, regions, and even all of humanity. President Putin sees this very clearly and has repeatedly pointed out that the West is failing and that Asia, represented by China, holds the future. The two heads of state, China and Russia, directly guide the development of China-Russia bilateral relations from a strategic height. This has led to continuously deepening political mutual trust, increasingly significant cooperation results, and a deeper-rooted generational friendship. Even when temporary contradictions arise in some areas, they are more like contradictions between brothers, and both sides strive to resolve them on the basis of high political mutual trust. I also discussed how both China and Russia are civilizational states, characterized by deep cultures and deep peoples. The people of both countries possess a resilient national character forged through historical vicissitudes, a mindset that values collective interests, and a cultural heritage where family and state are intertwined. From Tchaikovsky's Andante cantabile to Abing's Moon Reflected on Erquan Spring, both the Chinese and Russian nations can transform their past sufferings into spiritual wealth. From the Yellow River Cantata to the Sacred War, these are true reflections of the bloody battles fought by the Chinese and Soviet peoples 80 years ago, with the underlying theme of never yielding, fighting to the end, defeating fascism, and achieving national liberation and rejuvenation. This collective memory and national character of China and Russia are not possessed by a country like the United States. This also means that the depth, breadth, richness, and immense potential of the current development of China-Russia relations are unimaginable for a country like the United States, and even more incomprehensible for the transaction-oriented leaders of the United States. On May 7th this year, on the eve of President Xi's visit to Russia, a reporter from The Washington Post asked me about the impact of the Trump administration's closer relationship with Putin on China-Russia relations, and whether China was prepared to use the meeting between the Chinese and Russian leaders to demonstrate that Trump had not succeeded in pulling Russia away from China. I said that China is actually happy to see an improvement in Russia-US relations, because this generally contributes to world peace. I personally also believe that Trump is not a warmonger. He believes that endless wars have exhausted U.S. national strength, and this attitude is commendable. The theme of the Chinese president's visit to Russia this time was to solemnly commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism. As the main Asian and European battlefields of the world anti-fascist war, China and Russia both made immense national sacrifices, at the cost of tens of millions of casualties, making enormous contributions to their national survival and the salvation of humanity. Furthermore, the victory of the anti-fascist war laid the foundation for the international order and institutional arrangements based on the UN Charter, which is the cornerstone for maintaining world peace, security, and development. During this visit, President Xi and President Putin issued a joint statement in Moscow, emphasizing that China and the Soviet Union, as the main battlefields in Asia and Europe respectively, stood at the forefront of resisting Japanese militarism and Nazi Germany and their collaborators, and were the two core forces in resisting militarism and fascism. In today's world, China and Russia share the common responsibility and mission of upholding a correct historical view of World War II. We absolutely do not accept anyone or any country attempting to revive fascism. We were shocked by the absurd remarks recently made by U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth on Iwo Jima. He actually equated the Japanese soldiers who slaughtered over 20,000 U.S. troops during World War II with the fallen U.S. soldiers, calling them an example of heroic spirit, and asserting that this spirit would live on forever in the U.S.-Japan alliance. These remarks sparked strong indignation among the descendants of U.S. World War II veterans. Did Hegseth's actions stem from his own ignorance of history or from other political intentions? If Hegseth intentionally distorted history to maintain the so-called U.S.-Japan alliance, it would be extremely short-sighted and despicable, and would ultimately backfire. He then asked me whether President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia was meant to show a joint China-Russia stance against the United States, especially since China and Russia announced the establishment of a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination. What changes have occurred in China-Russia relations? I said, first, the United States has adopted an aggressive attitude towards both China and Russia for quite some time, which objectively promoted the closer ties between these two major powers. But this is far from the entirety of China-Russia relations. Second, I believe that the characteristics of China-Russia relations, non-alliance, non-confrontation, and not targeting a third party, can set an example for establishing a new type of major power relations today. We hope that China-US relations and Russia-US relations will also develop in this way. Third, the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination was proposed in 2019, and over the past 6 years, the development of relations between the two countries has been all-encompassing. Personally, I believe the most important thing is that it has injected new and powerful endogenous driving force into China-Russia relations. I suggested he read the joint statement on the plan for the development of key directions for China-Russia economic cooperation until 2030, in which both sides identified 8 key areas for practical cooperation, including trade, logistics, energy, and technological innovation. Recalling the early days of Russia's economic transition in 1991, bilateral trade between China and Russia was less than $5 billion, and it has now increased to $250 billion. This is 2024 data. In addition, various forms of cooperation, particularly in the agricultural and scientific technological fields, have shown remarkable highlights. Russia has become China's third-largest source of agricultural imports, and the annual growth rate of trade in goods like soybeans, trade in general, and beef between China and Russia has exceeded 20%. Both sides are jointly developing new projects in areas such as aerospace, quantum communication, and artificial intelligence. Cooperation in new materials, green development, and biomedicine has also become new growth points in bilateral relations. New breakthroughs have also been made in international industrial and supply chain cooperation, with exports of automotive and other mechanical and electrical products to Russia, and local investment in establishing production lines developing simultaneously. Chinese-made cars and electronic products are highly favored by local users in the Russian market, and their market share is continuously increasing. Furthermore, promoting the reform of the international order is also a key area of cooperation between the two sides. I personally believe that Russia is a revolutionary, and through a rather controversial military operation, it is, to some extent, aiming to change the Western-dominated unipolar international order. China is a reformer, integrating into globalization in a way that maximizes its good aspects and minimizes its bad aspects, and continuously pushing for reforms of the existing international order. The United States under Biden is the maintainer of this unipolar order, while under Trump, the United States became the abandoner, as he believes this unipolar order has overburdened the U.S., causing its economy to hollow out and decline. A multipolar world has now become a reality, but a multipolar world order has not yet fully emerged. China and Russia are both forward-looking, advocating for the establishment of a global order that benefits the vast majority of people worldwide. Trump's characteristic is to look backward, longing for 19th-century mercantilism and the past Yalta system, hoping that a few major powers will dominate and divide the world. Therefore, today, China and Russia share the mission of building a democratic, just, cooperative, and win-win multipolar world order. At 10 a.m. on May 9th, as the Kremlin bells rang, the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Great Patriotic War began. On the main viewing stand, the Chinese president stood shoulder to shoulder with leaders from over 20 countries and international organizations. And the honor guard of the Chinese People's Liberation Army also participated in the Red Square Parade. Watching the live broadcast of this parade, I couldn't help but recall the Moscow Red Square Parade on November 7, 1941, when Soviet Red Army soldiers, fresh from the flames of the anti-fascist front line, marched across Red Square and then directly headed to the war front to fight fascism to the death. I also remembered the founding ceremony of New China on October 1, 1949, where the PLA soldiers participating in the parade also came directly from the smoke and fire of battle, marched through Tiananmen Square to be reviewed by Chairman Mao, and many of these soldiers went directly to the front shortly after the founding ceremony to liberate the vast unliberated territories in China's northwest and southwest. The Soviet Union also became the first country to announce recognition of the People's Republic of China. Therefore, shared memories, shared interests, and shared missions have laid a solid foundation for the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination to reach new heights in the new era.
Professor Liu, you happened to visit Russia in early May, which coincided with the run-up to Russia's major celebration of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. Could you please give us an introduction to your personal impressions at that time, especially about the atmosphere in Moscow?
We arrived in Moscow on the evening of May 4th. Our first impression was the high importance the Russian side attached to the Chinese president's state visit and his participation in the 80th anniversary celebration of the Great Patriotic War. Because Russian mainstream media and television stations were continuously broadcasting segments of the Chinese president's governance philosophy, including on electronic screens on the streets. What impressed us the most were two keywords. One was victory, and the other was remembering history, remembering the history of World War II. So, the entire atmosphere was very enthusiastic, including the overall arrangements for receiving the Chinese president. For example, as Professor Zhang just mentioned in his speech, on the viewing stand of the Kremlin, leaders from over 20 countries, with so much preparation work involved, President Putin and the Chinese president had extensive talks, small group discussions, and even one-on-one tea chats, totaling nearly 10 hours. Then, when they finally ascended to the viewing stand, leaders from other countries had already gone up and were waiting on the stand. Finally, the Chinese president and President Putin walked up to the viewing stand together, and then the entire ceremony began. So, this arrangement also shows the high regard the Russian side has for China and the Chinese state leader. Moreover, this time, I found it particularly touching. Before his visit to Russia, the Chinese president published an article in Rossiyskaya Gazeta stating that the profound friendship between the Chinese and Russian peoples, forged with blood and lives, is like the Yellow River, flowing endlessly, and like the Volga River, broad and deep.
How is this major power relationship different from what people traditionally perceive or what exists in the world? Is this truly a new type of major power relationship?
Because we are very clear that we are strategic partners, and at the same time, we state that we are non-aligned, non-confrontational, and not targeting a third party. I visited Russia 3 times last year and will go again next month. Both China and Russia are major powers and are not dictated by any other country. We develop our normal strategic partnership. Non-alignment is very important, especially for a super-large country like China, a civilizational state that is itself a coherent and systemic whole. China can be said to be the largest non-aligned country in the world. Non-confrontation. This means friendship for generations, which is very important. We are 2 large countries sharing a border of several thousand kilometers, and yet feeling no worries about our vast hinterland. I think this is very important. As for not targeting a third party, it means that our relationship has its own endogenous logic. I fully agree with Professor Zhang's point that the China-Russia relationship is a very mature major power relationship. The concept of non-alliance, non-confrontation, and not targeting a third party was proposed by China. But this year, we can interestingly observe that when President Putin and the Chinese president met on several different occasions, Putin also stated the same. Russia-China relations are not affected by a third party. So, the Russian side has fully accepted the Chinese discourse. We are very familiar with these phrases. Therefore, I believe that on this issue, China and Russia are highly consistent. So, I think its own endogenous driving force, as our host just mentioned, means that the bilateral relationship has its own inherent logic of development.
The historical view of World War II is inherently a part of our correct understanding of history. If such important historical concepts are distorted or stigmatized, what impact will it have on interactions between countries?
I think this question is very important. As Professor Zhang just mentioned, some important facilities like monuments and museums are actually cultural symbols and representations. When we held a conference in Moscow this time, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia also attended, and he expressed gratitude to the Chinese government and local governments in cities like Wuhan and Chongqing for protecting and restoring the historical monuments of the Soviet Army. This actually demonstrates adherence to the correct historical view of World War II. So, what is the correct historical view of World War II? I think, as far as China and Russia are concerned, first, there were two major battlefields, the Eastern main battlefield and the European main battlefield. These two major battlefields involved two core forces, China and Russia, who played a decisive role in defeating fascism in this war. This is the first point. Second, I think some of Russia's statements in Moscow this time were very positive. 2 points impressed me the most. First, Putin himself explicitly mentioned the Eastern main battlefield and China's decisive contribution. Second, it was the leadership of the Communist Party of China. Because China started its war of resistance against Japanese aggression, the earliest, made the greatest sacrifices, and was in the most difficult situation. A basic judgment in the field of World War II history is that from 1931 onwards, for at least the first decade, China basically confronted the entire Japanese militarist aggression on its own. So, the situation was very difficult, and we made enormous contributions. And on this point, Putin himself also mentioned the leadership of the Communist Party of China. Of course, he also mentioned the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, which nailed the war criminals to the pillar of shame in history.
So why do we need to analyze the importance of a correct historical view of World War II for relations between major powers? Because the respect for the nation is embedded in the respect for history, and the respect for the nation is a very important cornerstone for building a new type of major power relationship.
Exactly. You put it perfectly. As we just discussed, for a new type of major power relationship, when we held a meeting in Moscow this time, the main venue was the one where the Chinese president visited the Moscow State Institute of International Relations in 2013. And it was in that very venue, back in 2013, that the Chinese president proposed the concept of a new type of international relations and a community with a shared future for mankind. The new type of international relations proposed by China essentially has 3 layers of meaning. Mutual respect, which is what everyone just talked about. At least as a first step, you need mutual respect. Then fairness and justice. And finally, cooperation for win-win outcomes. This is our understanding of a new type of international relations and a new type of major power relationship. And Americans don't acknowledge this. You want them to respect Russia and China, and they find it's a little too hard, right?
Professor Zhang also mentioned in his speech just now that when a reporter from the Washington Post interviewed you, I noticed that their questions were still stuck in the mindset that the relationship between these 3 major powers will always involve 2 ganging up on a third, regardless of which 2. Is this an inherent Western perception?
Indeed, if you frequently read Western mainstream media, for example, media manipulated by liberal Democrats in the U.S., backed by financial magnates, it's basically all the same cliché. They genuinely lack imagination. Sometimes, I truly feel sorry for them. Can they not break out of this framework and imagine another type of relationship? For example, what's wrong with a win-win? Why can't there be win-win or multi-win outcomes? They seem to find it unlikely. What China talks about, for instance, starting small and gradually expanding, they also find hard to comprehend. I think they have too many preconceived notions. I've also been interviewed by some Western journalists. They start by telling you how great your views are, saying they'll definitely report them truthfully, but in the end, very little of what you said gets reported. Sometimes even none at all. They have politically correct gatekeepers who would probably ensure you lose your job if you fully reflected Chinese and Russian viewpoints. Yes, so Kissinger once famously said, because he was a realist, that when facing 2 adversaries, we choose the weaker one and unite against the third party. So, for U.S. foreign policy, its so-called international relations research is basically enemy research, because a common enemy exists. So it needs to form alliances. It needs to unite to jointly target a third party. This is its logic. Therefore, the history of international relations since modern times also shows that alliances and realpolitik have been its mainstream. However, as the Chinese president said, our bodies have entered the 21st century, but our minds and brains cannot remain in the 19th century. Moreover, we are now forming a whole set of our own concepts and practices. For example, with the Belt and Road Initiative, we advocate discussing together, building together, and benefiting together. In legal matters, we have now established the International Organization for Mediation. In all aspects, we are starting to have our own things. This time, the China-ASEAN GCC Summit is also remarkable.
The first time these three parties sat together for a summit.
So, I think there are many innovative methods here. Once China's strength grows, what I do is very likely to become an international standard. If you don't accept it, I will simply state it, and as long as most countries accept it, eventually you will gradually have to accept it, or at least a part of it, because it's hard to swim against the big current.
Yes, in the UN Charter, mediation is a very important method for resolving conflicts and disputes between countries, but it's rarely used.
The concept of mediation is indeed in the UN Charter, but such an institution has never been established. Now, we are finding this concept in the Charter and further expanding on it, backed by China's extensive practices. Regarding relevant UN documents, there's another concept. You see, we now have the UN Human Rights Council and various committees and subcommittees on rights. However, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are also concepts of duty and responsibility. These can also give rise to institutions. For example, in the future, a UN International Responsibility Commission could be established. China can promote this because we talk about the balance between rights and obligations, and the balance between rights and responsibilities. The approach of the International Organization for Mediation is very enlightening.
Let me ask Professor Liu again. During your recent visit to Russia, what did you perceive from local scholars regarding Russia-US relations, including the future of the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
We stayed in Moscow for a while, then in St. Petersburg for some time. And last year we traveled from the Far East to Khabarovsk to Irkutsk, all the way to Novosibirsk. The so-called impact of the war is still very small. The common people are living and working peacefully. There are still some recruitment advertisements on the streets, but there is no forced conscription. This reflects Putin's approach of separating the front line and the home front, trying his best to ensure the peaceful lives, work, and normal progression of the people at home. As for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we know Trump said he would end it in 24 hours. Russian scholars, however, say that it's difficult to end it in 24 weeks, let alone 24 hours. So, overall, regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russians, including ordinary people and scholars, also very much hope for peace and want the war to stop. But more importantly, they hope to eliminate the root causes. They don't want to talk about it unless you explicitly ask them, because it is, after all, an internal conflict within Slavic civilization. To resolve international disputes, we cannot solely rely on Western discourse and practices. Additionally, from the American side, there are actually many difficulties. Because first, Congress passed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA. And then there are thousands of various sanctions. Lifting all of these is very difficult. With CAATSA, they can accuse you, and after legislation, many things become very difficult to amend. China's reform and opening up journey has shown us that our legislation is very cautious. We first implement administrative measures or relevant regulations, repeatedly practice them, and when conditions are ripe, then they are turned into laws. These are all experiences the U.S. should learn from. From China's perspective, I don't think it's a bad thing. If our relationship with Russia is already quite mature and strong, and both sides' relations are more predictable and stable, with leaders who govern like statesmen, and have more long-term considerations and arrangements, that's a very good thing. If the US keeps changing, it will be detrimental to itself. Moreover, Putin has said it several times recently, publicly, that the Chinese model is better than the American model. They are actually learning from the Chinese model in many areas now. I myself will be going to Russia next month to participate in the Russia Future Forum 2050, which is about formulating plans for the next 25 years. They have invited Chinese scholars to participate.
We are also very curious about how they will make this plan.
I told them that our 5-year plans and 10-year plans were learned from the Soviet Union, but we reformed and innovated them, and they can certainly learn from some of our experiences. I think the China-Russia relationship is much more mature than either the US-Russia relationship or the China-US relationship. Yes, when I was in Moscow this time, I met an old gentleman at the venue. Of course, we were discussing some current issues, such as the US-Russia negotiations. He also mentioned that the phenomenon of Trump is short-term, and US policies change too quickly, and internal political forces in the US are constantly entangled. But, in contrast, China has this kind of certainty. So, his judgment was that if he were Putin, he wouldn't need to do anything as the US changes too quickly. What would you do? It will change very soon. So, from this perspective, there is a general view in Russia now that Russia-US relations can be normalized, and in fact, they are already doing so, such as the re-engagement between diplomatic agencies, because in the past, there were large-scale expulsions of diplomats. This is already happening. That is to say, Russia expects the normalization of Russia-US relations to be achieved, but he highly doubts whether Russia and the US can develop a partnership. In Russia, there is still a deep sense of distrust towards the United States.
Russia's current decision to look eastward is not a brief thought or decision. It's a conclusion drawn after decades of unsuccessful attempts to embrace the West and having been taught a bitter lesson by the West.
Yes, behind it is their belief that the United States and the West are in decline, which is what almost all their scholars observe. I experienced a very interesting incident last year. We were participating in the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, and President Putin personally delivered a speech. A Chinese leader also attended the event. After the speech, Putin and the Chinese leader sat together, and a TV host conducted a dialogue with them. The host asked our Chinese leader a question, saying that we are here at this meeting, but we feel that China's investment in Siberia and the entire Far East is still too little. Why do you invest so little? Why don't you invest more? Putin's expression was very interesting. He said, "How can you ask such a sharp question to our most distinguished guest?" He said, "Let me answer." He said, "I just visited Harbin, and you see how Harbin attracts foreign investment. We should learn from them. We have a lot of bureaucracy and many problems, and we need to solve these problems. This is what I mean. When problems arise now, there's an open and honest attitude, and everyone works to solve these problems from a positive perspective, based on political mutual trust. So, in some specific economic and trade areas, for example, Russians now have some concerns, some worries, that China's development is too fast. China's rise is too rapid. There is a saying in Russia that Russia will become China's little brother. Because, you see, during the Cold War, the West keeps saying that. The media openly says that. In the past, we called the Soviet Union the elder brother, and now it's relegated to little brother. And there's another saying that Russia will become a gas station for China's rise, because so much of their oil and natural gas is going to China. China-Russia economic and trade relations have certainly achieved great results. But, as Professor Zhang just mentioned, there is a voice from the Russian side that says China's investment is insufficient, too stingy. But no matter what, the contradictions between China and Russia are always secondary compared to their cooperation. I think both of these propositions are non-existent. As Professor Zhang just mentioned, Russians have drawn painful lessons, right? Gorbachev's turn to the West resulted in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, including the Yeltsin era and the brief honeymoon period of Russia-US relations in Putin's early years. But it did not bring genuine respect from the United States for Russia. It's impossible to make Americans respect Russia. Russians have seen this very clearly, so Putin's view on the United States has undergone a fundamental change. So, I think the first point is that in the post-Putin era, that is, for future leaders, someone similar to Gorbachev is impossible. Second, regarding your question about Russia and the US joining forces against China, as I just mentioned, the deep distrust towards the US within Russia means that normalization is possible, but a partnership is not. The relationship between Russia and the US cannot be compared to that between China and Russia. You would find it hard to comprehend. When we were in Moscow this time, on Victory Day, I felt the common people were still radiating a very cheerful and joyful atmosphere, right? They weren't as depressed as they were when the Soviet Union dissolved and they underwent such a difficult transition. They were very polite and courteous towards Chinese people. So, I think the second proposition is also non-existent. Moreover, we also just talked about Russia's West and East. One Russian scholar said that if Peter the Great were to choose again, he would open a window facing the East, not the West. I'd like to add 2 points. First, Gorbachev's reforms at the time ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, followed by the disaster brought by liberalization under the guidance of Western and American experts. Every Russian personally experienced this. The suffering was indescribable. Because we all visited Russia at that time, male life expectancy dropped to their 50s, a decrease of over 10 years. People's gas and electricity supplies were affected. Savings became worthless overnight, and pensions disappeared. That was the situation. Regarding the possibility of Gorbachev reappearing, Gorbachev actually had the courage to run for Russian president in 1996. Do you know how many votes he got? Less than 1%. He was abandoned by the Russian people. Of course, you can make theoretical assumptions, but the probability of it happening is almost zero. Second, the awakening of Russia this time is indeed related to their deepened understanding of the US, and also to their deepened understanding of China. Because when we participated in the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last year, Putin also delivered a speech. He began by saying that China is already the world's largest economy, far ahead of the second place. He didn't say who the second place was. And then he said that so many of our experts have studied different development models in the world, and we believe the Chinese model is better than other models. Much better than the Soviet model and the American model. He has such a cognition, and it is a relatively common consensus among Russia's intellectual and political elites.
And through this discussion, we also want to help everyone gain a deeper understanding of Russia and the new type of major power diplomatic relationship built by China and Russia. Thank you all, and goodbye.
这就是中国，听张伟伟说。